There's a moment many experience but struggle to name. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's the quiet feeling that something is off, a shift in energy, a subtle distance where warmth used to live, and the mind begins asking questions the heart doesn't want answered. Stay with me. Because near the end of this video, I'll share something most men never realize about this situation, something that can change how you see yourself, not just her. If this kind of psychological clarity matters to you, gently support the channel by liking and subscribing, not for the algorithm, but because these conversations are rare and they matter. When a woman has crossed a boundary she once believed she never would, the first thing that changes is not her behavior toward you, it's her relationship with herself. Contrary to popular belief, most women do not experience immediate relief or excitement afterward. What often appears instead is a quiet internal conflict. Her self-image fractures. She now has to reconcile who she believes she is with what she has done. And human psychology has a powerful instinct when faced with inner contradiction. It tries to restore balance. This is where many men misinterpret what they see. After cheating, a woman may become emotionally distant, not because she feels nothing, but because closeness intensifies guilt. Emotional intimacy acts like a mirror. It reflects her actions back at her. Distance, on the other hand, dulls that reflection. So she may seem colder, less responsive, or oddly neutral, not angry, not affectionate, just absent. Another common response is overcompensation. Some women become unusually pleasant, overly agreeable, or suddenly attentive. This isn't manipulation in the cartoon sense. It's psychological self-soothing. By being kind, helpful, or calm, she unconsciously tries to convince herself that she is still a good person. Good behavior becomes a way to quiet the inner noise. Men often read this as renewed love. In reality, it's often an attempt to stabilize her internal identity. You might also notice changes in how she speaks. Conversations become more surface level. Fewer personal disclosures, less emotional risk. This isn't accidental. Deep conversation invites truth, and truth at this stage feels dangerous. So she may redirect, minimize, or keep things light. Not because she doesn't care, but because depth threatens to expose what she's trying to contain. Here's something rarely discussed. Guilt does not always look like remorse. Sometimes it looks like irritation, impatience, criticism. Why? Because guilt is uncomfortable, and the mind seeks an external outlet for internal tension. By focusing on your flaws, your mistakes, or your energy, she temporarily shifts attention away from her own actions. This isn't conscious strategy, it's emotional self-defense. What's important for you, as a man watching this, is not to obsess over decoding every behavior. Psychology is not a lie detector, it's a lens. And this lens reveals something deeper than whether cheating occurred. It reveals how emotional responsibility, or the lack of it, shapes behavior after trust is broken. And that brings us to the part most men miss entirely. What a woman does after cheating often has less to do with you than with whether she has the emotional maturity to face herself. And that distinction is everything. After the initial internal conflict sets in, the next psychological shift happens quietly but powerfully. Justification. The human mind struggles to live in a state where actions and identity don't align. So to reduce discomfort, it begins rewriting the story. Not rewriting facts, but rewriting meaning. This is where many men feel confused, even destabilized, because the relationship narrative they shared no longer feels mutual. A woman who has cheated may begin subtly reframing the relationship in her mind. Moments that were once neutral or positive become evidence of dissatisfaction. Small disagreements suddenly carry more emotional weight. This isn't because the past has changed, but because the present needs justification. If she can convince herself that the relationship was already broken, distant, or unfulfilling, then her actions feel less like a betrayal and more like an outcome. Again, this is not always a conscious process. It's the psyche protecting itself from shame. You may notice her language shift from we to I, from shared responsibility to individual emotional framing. Statements become more personal, more self-referenced. She may speak more about her feelings, her needs, her stress, while showing less curiosity about yours. This narrowing of emotional focus is a common post-boundary response. When guilt is present, empathy often contracts. Another psychological response is emotional compartmentalization. She separates parts of her life to avoid collision. One version of her exists in daily routines with you. Another version exists internally, carrying the weight of what happened. This can make her appear inconsistent, warm one day, distant the next, present but unreachable. It's not confusion about you, it's fragmentation within herself. Some women respond by seeking control. When instability feels threatened, control becomes grounding. This may show up as increased monitoring, questioning, or sudden boundaries that didn't exist before. Ironically, the person who broke trust may become more guarded, not because she fears you, but because she fears exposure. Transparency feels risky when there's something to hide, even from oneself. Here's an important psychological truth most men never hear. Guilt doesn't automatically create honesty. In many cases, it delays it because honesty would force a collapse of the justification system holding her together. So instead, the mind buys time. Time to see if feelings fade. Time to see if the situation resolves itself. Time to regain emotional balance without confrontation. During this phase, men often make a critical mistake. They chase clarity. They ask more questions. They lean in emotionally, hoping presence will restore connection. But leaning into emotional uncertainty often amplifies imbalance. The more you seek reassurance, the more pressure builds. And pressure psychologically pushes people deeper into defense, not openness. What matters here is not whether she admits anything. It's whether she takes responsibility for emotional disconnection. Responsibility is not confession, it's behavior, it's consistency, it's empathy that doesn't fluctuate based on comfort. And here's where the deeper lesson begins to form. One that isn't about catching signs or proving truth. It's about recognizing that after cheating, a woman's behavior is shaped less by what she did, and more by how willing she is to face the discomfort of who she became in that moment. That willingness or refusal determines everything that follows. As time passes, another layer of psychology begins to surface. Identity protection. When a woman has cheated, her sense of self is under threat. Most people don't see themselves as disloyal or harmful, so when actions contradict that self-image, the mind doesn't rush to self-condemnation. It searches for stability, and stability often comes from comparison. This is where subtle emotional contrasts emerge. She may begin unconsciously comparing you to an abstract version of someone else. Not necessarily a specific person, but an idea of excitement, ease, or emotional escape. These comparisons are rarely spoken aloud, but they influence behavior. She may appear less patient, less impressed, or harder to please. Not because you changed, but because her internal benchmark shifted. At the same time, she may emotionally withdraw in ways that feel confusing. Eye contact fades. Physical presence feels thinner. Conversations lose their depth. This withdrawal isn't always a sign of lost affection. It's often a sign of inner division. Emotional closeness invites vulnerability, and vulnerability threatens the protective narrative she's built. So she stays half present, enough to function, not enough to feel exposed. Some women respond by becoming unusually self-focused, more attention to appearance, more emphasis on independence, more insistence on personal space. This isn't always about attracting someone else. Often it's about reclaiming a sense of control and desirability. After a boundary violation, the psyche seeks reassurance. I am still valuable. I still have agency. Self-focus becomes a coping mechanism. Here's where many men misread the situation. They assume these changes mean she no longer cares, but psychology suggests something more nuanced. Emotional detachment can be a form of containment. She is holding parts of herself apart to prevent collapse. Caring still exists, but it's constrained by fear of confrontation, fear of judgment, or fear of irreversible change. You may also notice increased defensiveness around ordinary topics. Neutral questions feel intrusive. Gentle curiosity is met with irritation. This happens because defensiveness isn't about the question. It's about what the question might uncover when the inner world feels fragile. Even harmless inquiries feel like threats. What's important to understand is this. After cheating, many women do not immediately decide what they want. They enter a psychological limbo. Part of them wants normalcy. Another part wants escape from guilt. This internal tension creates inconsistent behavior. Moments of closeness followed by sudden distance. For a man, this phase is emotionally exhausting. You feel like you're walking on uncertain ground, unsure whether to step forward or pull back. And here's the hard truth. Your stability becomes more important than her clarity. The more grounded you are, the less reactive you become. And emotional steadiness is not indifference. It's self-respect. Psychological health in relationships isn't measured by how much you tolerate confusion. It's measured by how clearly you can observe it without losing yourself inside it. And that brings us closer to the central question, not just what a woman does after cheating, but what her behavior reveals about her capacity for emotional accountability. Because accountability doesn't show up in words. It shows up in how someone manages discomfort when avoidance would be easier. That distinction becomes impossible to ignore as time moves forward. As the psychological tension continues, a turning point quietly approaches. Not a dramatic moment, but an internal fork in the road. At this stage, a woman who is cheated begins responding less to guilt itself and more to the consequences of carrying it. Guilt is heavy, it demands resolution, and the mind will eventually choose one of two paths: integration or deflection. Integration is rare but powerful. It happens when a woman begins to accept responsibility internally, even if she hasn't spoken it aloud. You'll notice this not through apologies, but through consistency. Her emotional presence stabilizes. She becomes more attentive to how her actions affect you. There is a softness in her behavior, not performative, not exaggerated, but grounded. She stops avoiding depth. She allows difficult conversations to exist without shutting down or redirecting. Deflection, on the other hand, is far more common. This is when the psyche decides that carrying guilt is too painful and the only way to survive is to externalize it. Responsibility subtly shifts outward. The relationship becomes the problem. Circumstances become the problem. You eventually may become the problem, not through direct accusation at first, but through tone, distance, and quiet dissatisfaction. You might sense that nothing you do quite feels right anymore. Effort is met with neutrality, support is met with silence. Or worse, used as evidence that you're trying too hard or changing now. This is not cruelty, it's psychological displacement. When internal blame feels unbearable, the mind seeks relief elsewhere. At this stage, many women begin emotionally rehearsing an exit. Even if they don't consciously plan one, this doesn't always mean leaving physically. Sometimes it means emotionally detaching while remaining present, going through motions, maintaining structure, but withholding vulnerability. The relationship becomes functional, not intimate. Here's something most men misunderstand. Staying does not always mean choosing the relationship. Sometimes it means avoiding the disruption that truth would cause. Familiarity can feel safer than honesty, especially when honesty threatens identity, reputation, or self-image. You may notice an increase in emotional unpredictability. Some days feel almost normal, other days feel cold and distant. This inconsistency isn't manipulation, it's ambivalence. She hasn't resolved the inner conflict, so it leaks into behavior. And the more unresolved it remains, the more draining it becomes for both of you. This is where your role matters, not as a fixer, but as a grounded observer. Chasing reassurance during this phase often backfires. It intensifies pressure, which strengthens deflection. Calm presence, clear boundaries, and emotional self-containment send a different psychological signal. I am stable, with or without clarity, and that stability does something unexpected. It removes the distraction of your reaction. Without that distraction, she is left alone with her choices. Integration becomes possible, or deflection becomes obvious. What happens next depends less on what she feels and more on what she can face, because feelings fluctuate, character doesn't. And as we move closer to the deeper insight of this topic, one truth becomes increasingly clear. What a woman does after cheating is not just about remorse or desire, it's about whether she has the courage to confront discomfort without rewriting reality to escape it. As the inner conflict reaches its peak, a subtle but defining behavior often appears. Emotional minimization. This is when the gravity of what happened begins to shrink in her language, her reactions, and her framing of events. Not because it was insignificant, but because holding its full weight has become unbearable. Minimization is not denial, it's reduction. You may hear phrases that soften impact, not excuses, but reframes. The focus shifts away from harm and towards circumstance, timing, or emotional states. This psychological move allows her to function without fully confronting the breach of trust. And for many men, this is the moment. Confusion turns into quiet disillusionment because something important is being bypassed, not just facts, but emotional accountability. At the same time, she may become more focused on moving forward than understanding what was broken. Progress becomes the priority. Closure is suggested before clarity is reached. This isn't because she doesn't care about healing, it's because revisiting pain feels threatening. The future feels safer than the past, but unresolved experiences don't disappear. They settle beneath the surface, shaping dynamics in unseen ways. Some women in this phase seek reassurance from the relationship itself. They look for signs that things are okay again without fully engaging in repair. Normal routines resume. Conflict is avoided. There's a quiet hope that time alone will smooth what honesty would disrupt. This creates an emotional imbalance. Structure without safety, peace without truth. Here's where a man's self-awareness becomes crucial. When you sense that something serious is being minimized, your intuition is responding to incongruence. Your nervous system is picking up on what words are not carrying. Ignoring that signal in the name of harmony often leads to deeper resentment later. Emotional health doesn't come from suppressing discomfort. It comes from honoring it calmly. Another response you may notice is emotional bargaining. She may invest in certain areas, kindness, support, shared activities, while remaining closed in others. This selective engagement creates the illusion of balance, but intimacy is not built from pieces. It requires wholeness, and wholeness requires truth, even when it's uncomfortable. This phase often tests a man's sense of worth. You may begin questioning whether your needs are too much, whether your expectations are unreasonable, or whether you're overthinking. This self-doubt is understandable, but it's also a signal. When emotional reality is consistently softened or bypassed, the burden of adjustment silently shifts to the person who feels it most. What matters now is not confrontation, but clarity. Clarity about what you are willing to accept. Clarity about what emotional responsibility looks like to you, and clarity about the difference between forgiveness and avoidance. Forgiveness is an internal release. Avoidance is an external performance. One leads to peace, the other leads to quiet erosion. As we approach the final layers of this topic, the focus shifts away from her actions and toward your position within the dynamic, because the most important outcome of this experience is not whether the relationship survives, but whether you emerge from it grounded, intact, and emotionally awake. And that understanding becomes undeniable in what follows. At this stage, the psychology shifts again. But now the shift is less about her and more about the relational balance between you. After cheating and after avoidance, justification, distancing, and minimization have all had their moment, something subtle happens. Power begins to reorganize, not power in a dramatic sense, but emotional leverage. If accountability has not been fully integrated, the relationship often settles into an unspoken agreement. Certain topics become off limits. Certain emotions are quietly discouraged. You may feel that maintaining calm requires restraint on your part, that asking for reassurance risks tension, that expressing hurt feels inconvenient. And this is not because you're wrong. It's because unresolved guilt reshapes the emotional rules of engagement. Many men, without realizing it, begin carrying emotional weight that isn't theirs to carry. They become more careful with words, more forgiving of inconsistency, more willing to self-silence in the name of peace. This is how emotional imbalance stabilizes itself, not through force, but through accommodation. Here's the psychological truth. Most men were never taught. When one person avoids responsibility, the other often absorbs it. And absorption feels like maturity until it becomes erosion. You may notice yourself becoming hyper-aware of her moods, adjusting your behavior to prevent distance, interpreting silence, managing emotional climate. This is not strength, it's overfunctioning, and over time, it quietly disconnects you from your own emotional center. Some women at this point sense this shift, not consciously but intuitively. They feel less pressure to engage deeply because the relationship no longer demands it. Stability is maintained without full presence, and while this may look like things are fine, psychologically something essential is missing: mutual emotional risk. This is where a crucial distinction emerges. Repair requires vulnerability from both sides. Stability without vulnerability is not healing, it's suspension. And suspension cannot last forever. Eventually, something gives. Either intimacy fades or resentment grows, or self-respect begins to ask difficult questions. What matters here is not asserting dominance or demanding confession. It's reclaiming emotional authorship. That means staying connected to your own truth without aggression. It means recognizing that your need for clarity, safety, and emotional reciprocity is not excessive. It's human. A grounded man does not beg for emotional responsibility. He does not chase it. He creates an environment where it is either met or its absence becomes clear. This phase often feels like emotional stillness before movement. Nothing dramatic happens, but internally you begin to see more clearly. You stop interpreting confusion as complexity. You stop confusing endurance with love. And you start noticing how peace feels when it's real versus when it's merely quiet. And that clarity leads to the final, most important understanding of all. Not about her behavior, but about what this entire experience reveals to you about trust, self-worth, and the kind of emotional connection that actually sustains a man over time. That understanding changes everything. There is a moment that arrives quietly, often without ceremony, when the focus finally shifts away from what she did and settles where it always belonged: on what you learned. This is the part few conversations ever reach because it requires emotional honesty without bitterness, and yet it's the most transformative part of all. What a woman does after cheating is not a universal script. Some integrate responsibility, many avoid it. But the deeper truth is this: her behavior becomes a mirror, not of your worth, but of her relationship with accountability. And once you see that clearly, something inside you steadies. You begin to understand that confusion was never a sign of complexity. It was a signal of misalignment. That emotional inconsistency wasn't mysterious, it was unresolved, and that your instinct to seek clarity wasn't weakness. It was your nervous system asking for safety. Here's what emotionally mature men eventually realize. Trust is not rebuilt through time alone. It's rebuilt through congruence, through words and actions matching, through discomfort being faced rather than managed. And when that congruence is absent, no amount of patience can substitute for it. This realization doesn't harden you, it softens you in the right places. You stop personalizing another person's avoidance. You stop measuring your value by someone else's willingness to be honest. And you stop negotiating with dynamics that quietly ask you to disappear. If accountability was present, you'll feel it. Not as reassurance, but as relief. Your body will relax. Your mind will stop scanning. Emotional safety will return gradually, naturally. If it wasn't present, you'll feel something else instead. Clarity, while uncomfortable at first, is deeply stabilizing. The goal was never to catch, expose, or punish. The goal was to see clearly without losing yourself, to respond rather than react, to remain grounded in your values, even when the ground felt uncertain. And here is the truth most men never hear, but carry with them once they do. Someone else's betrayal does not diminish your capacity for trust. It reveals the importance of discernment. It doesn't make you guarded, it makes you awake. If you've stayed with me this long, it tells me you're not looking for blame. You're looking for understanding. And understanding is what allows you to choose differently, whether that means rebuilding with eyes open or stepping forward with self-respect intact. So as you move on from this conversation, carry this with you. Emotional integrity is not loud, it doesn't demand, it doesn't chase. It stands quietly in truth and allows everything else to reveal itself. And that quiet strength is what ultimately defines the man you become.